Halito, welcome everyone. Welcome back to our Chata Tisholi. Saho Chifua, Megan Baker. I'm a research associate here in historic preservation. This week, my colleague in historic preservation, the delightful Ryan Spring, is joining us for our conversation with Dr. Greg O'Brien. Could you say us a little bit about yourself, Ryan?
Sure. My name is Ryan Spring. I work here at the Historic Preservation Department. I've been here since 2011. I've had several different roles in the department, but now I'm an archaeological technician, and I love it greatly. But today we are here to talk with the awesome Greg O'Brien, and I'm so excited.
So for those of you who don't know, Dr. Greg O'Brien is the head of Department of History and an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He's the author of Choctaws in a Revolutionary Age, 1750 to 1830, and the editor of two collections, Pre-Removal Choctaw History and The Native South. Given his expertise on this area of early Choctaw history, we're super excited to have him. We've learned so much from him over the years. We've referenced his work a lot, and so it's really great to have him join us today. And so Ryan will be handling the conversation with Dr. O'Brien, so take it away, Ryan.
Awesome. So for everyone watching, feel free to post your questions. We have a few questions, that we kind of went over with Dr. O'Brien to, send to him, let him look at. But, this is, it's an informal webinar. So, feel free to post your questions, and we'll go back and forth. And, this is about, it's about learning. It's about education. It's about sharing. So, let's just pretend this is a big round circle. Cool. Well, Greg, so the first thing I have for you is question one. But what interested you in studying history? What was it that kind of pushed you that direction?
Well, thank you, Ryan and Megan. First, I want to say that it's a real honor to be participating in this forum, and thank you very much for inviting me. So my interest in history, I guess, goes back to my youth. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, where the University of Virginia is. And that's an area, steeped particularly in colonial revolutionary era history. Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, James Madison, all right there or close by. And then, of course, growing up in a state like Virginia that has a very rich historical parks tradition and so forth. I think that is probably what interested me from a very early age. And I was always much more interested in that earlier era of Virginia history, the colonial era, the Revolutionary era, and not nearly as much the Civil War era, even though that's obviously also a major portion of Virginia's history as well. So that started my interest in when I went to college, Randolph-Macon College, a liberal arts college in Ashland, Virginia. I majored in history and minored in political science. I'm kind of still sort of a political science junkie on the side for, probably this election night. I probably won't go to bed at all watching results come in. But history's always been my true love, and particularly, again, the kind of what we typically refer to in American history as the colonial era or the Revolutionary era. When I went to graduate school and worked on my master's, was really the first time that I was in a department in where the American history field had advanced enough. So this is the very early 1990s, where American Indian history was an accepted, normal part of American history. So I've learned almost nothing about American Indian history in any history course I took as a high school student or as a undergraduate. But as a master's student, I was able to take coursework in history, but also interact with some anthropologists. And my MA thesis was actually on the Palatine Chieftain and its encounter initially for the first few decades after the English arrived in Jamestown. That was a field, that particular topic of Palatine history and so forth was also a field that a lot of other much more established scholars were focusing on at that moment. So when I started PhD work with Colin Calloway who was then at the University of Wyoming. He had just completed his book, The American Revolution in Indian Country. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a book that has 8 community studies where he looks at 8 different Native communities throughout the era of the American Revolution, the long era of the American Revolution. And he has a chapter on the Chickasaws, for example, but he does not have one on the Choctaws. And he told me, he said, part of the reason was there was so much material, so many sources available on Choctaw history in that era. He simply did not have time to devote to going through all that and include it as a chapter in his book. And that was, all you have to tell a new PhD student, it was like being told, hey, here's a topic, at least in its general outlines, it has plenty of sources. Go look at it, see what you can find. So my very first semester of PhD work, I wrote a research paper on some aspects of kind of Revolutionary era, American Revolutionary era, Choctaw history, and then in a real sense, never looked back. That eventually became my PhD dissertation and first book. And in the meantime, Colin Calloway had taken the job that he still has at Dartmouth. And Dartmouth does not have a PhD program in history. So I was able to transfer to a school and a program where I had been accepted before, but had decided to work with Colin Calloway instead. And that was at the University of Kentucky to work with Theda Perdue and her husband, Mike Green. And so I spent about, a third of my PhD career with Colin Calloway and the remaining 2/3 with Theda Perdue and Mike Green. And even though it was a difficult transition in terms of moving across the country and it was expensive and that sort of thing, in terms of being a scholar and an ethno-historian, I ended up working with 3 really top scholars in the field. And I think that helped a lot. So, and they encouraged the topic I was working on and pushed me in more kind of ethno-historical directions, and that resulted in my dissertation.
Awesome. So one thing you pointed out is having good mentors is really helpful for.
Yes. Vital. Absolutely vital. If there are any prospective graduate students out there who are thinking about going to graduate school, or you're in a master's program thinking about a doctoral program, that when you're thinking of doctoral programs, my advice would be always apply to and contact the scholars that you want to work with. As long as they are at a department that offers a PhD, don't worry about what department it is, worry about who the scholar is you would work with. And that's what should be foremost in your mind as far as how you complete PhD work, in my view.
That's good advice. Thank you. So you talked about how your dissertation ended up moving into your first book, Choctaws in a Revolutionary Age. So that book looks at the 1750 to the end of the 1830 period, from the Choctaw Civil War to removal. What's significant about this period in Choctaw history, and why did you decide to focus on it?
Right. Well, so my initial focus, as I mentioned, was simply to kind of gain an understanding, how did the American Revolution impact Choctaw history, and the reverse of that, how did Choctaw people impact the American Revolution? So that's kind of the history side of why I initially started looking at that era, why I wanted to focus on that era. But then when I really got into it, and cultural anthropology was one of my minor fields at the doctoral level, both when I was at Wyoming and when I was at Kentucky. And, some of the, and then of course, the history scholars I work with are ethno-historians too, so that, they push more of a ethno-historical focus and anthropological focus. And what I began to realize in looking at Choctaw history in that era, basically the second half of the 18th century and then into the early 19th century, is, obviously it's an era of massive transformation on one hand. There's massive economic change, there's changes in education, there's changes in what historians have typically referred to as cultural change, or anthropologists as well have referred to as cultural change. And those are kind of obvious, right? If you started with 1750, You find Choctaw people who, yes, they had fought a war against each other, but as a whole entity, they were largely in control of their own destiny, right? At that time in 1750, you have, as far as European colonial powers, you have the British and the French and the Spanish are in Florida. So there are colonial pressures, imperial pressures, but they're not intruding very directly into Choctaw life. They're not asking for Choctaw land at this point. By the end of this era, of course, then we have the Americans, and the Spanish are now in New Orleans. The British are gone. And there are, much greater pressures by particularly Americans to gain access to Choctaw land, and they're using all sorts of economic leverage and so forth to do that. So there's very easily recognizable change happening in this era, and it's a really, it's a relatively short time period, right? It's a half century, slightly over a half century. But what I became interested in as well, and I know you have a question you wanted to ask me about one of my colleagues, so I want to go ahead and work him in. Jamie Carson, who was a graduate school colleague of mine. He finished 2 years before I did, working with Mike Green and Theda Purdue. And one of the things, and he obviously wrote about Choctaw history too, and Searching for the Bright Path. And he noticed there were a lot of continuities from kind of pre-colonial Choctaw history and its focus on what he called Mississippian morality, and he had various components of what that meant, but he saw continuities of that basic kind of Choctaw outlook on the world still existing, at least in the era of removal, right? At least into the early to mid 19th century. So from my perspective, as I got further into this, I didn't want to just talk about the American Revolution. Instead, I wanted to really talk about this kind of revolution among the Choctaw people themselves, and by which I mean not a physical or fighting revolution so much as really an ideological revolution, where there's this real, at least in the historiography and the literature, there's this real conflict between trying to explain cultural change, which had really dominated the literature on American Indian history up until at least the early 90s, and in some cases still does. That cultures change, and usually the change is to the negative, right? It's for the worse. There's decline. But there's also, as people like Jamie Carson and others were really starting to point out in the early 90s and mid and late 90s, there's also cultural continuity. There's also survival, right? Choctaw people died, yes, because of removal and other imperial or colonial events, but they also survived, right? And they still survive. So the history can't be dominated only by kind of a declensionist narrative of negative cultural change. In my view, we have to also explain, well, how does cultural continuity take place at the same time? How do they both take place at the same time? And so that's where I really then kind of shifted my focus a bit to focus on ideology. So in that sense, this is absolutely my work is absolutely a work of ethnohistory, but in some ways it's intellectual history as well, because I'm looking at how Choctaw elite people, and elite could be defined in a variety of ways, and that's part of the point, that the definitions of what made someone elite changed or broadened over the second half of the 18th century. And that enabled or allowed for Choctaw people who aspired to be leaders or who became leaders, to draw on kind of new or novel ways to say, this is why I should be a leader. And so to put it in kind of simplistic terms, it goes, the transition that I identified was that leaders really had a very spiritual basis to their power and their authority at the start or in the early parts of my study. And towards the end of it, that had new possibilities that opened up where those who could amass economic power could also assert political power. And that was new, at least in the sense that it was occurring by the early 19th century. So to me, it's a fundamental era of Choctaw history. And of course, the broad outlines of that would have occurred among many, many Native groups, right? As they grappled with a rising United States But even before that, in grappling with colonial powers, imperial powers, some of these notions about, who should have power, what does that mean, what will they do with that power, is it legitimate or not? And of course, there are all sorts of disputes about this. People absolutely disagreed about the direction that Choctaw society was going in over this time period, as I'm sure they have ever since and do in all societies, right? But to me, this was a much more satisfying way to be able to see how individuals or community groups, family units could make decisions within some parameters, of course, within some restrictions, where they could make some decisions about where to go. Do we adhere to what we think is the right way to do it, a traditional way to do it, or do we adhere to, okay, we want to maintain our Choctaw identity, yes, but can we borrow some of these other ideas, some of these other techniques to assert or protect our power?
I think that's a great point. A lot of people talk about, well, they're being acculturated. Well, it's more like adaptation. Let's take these things, bring them into our own society and make them our own. Right. I want to back up for a second and maybe do some definitions real quick.
Sure.
So there's a few things that have come up. Would you be able to explain in your own words what ethnohistory is?
Sure. So to me, ethnohistory is for doing ethnohistory in order to understand indigenous or native peoples and their history. Using ethnohistorical techniques is combining the recognition of change over time and the documentary source space from history with the kind of theoretical approaches and comparative analysis and archaeological work from anthropology. And then what I would call the third leg of that tripartite stool that makes up ethnohistory is native people themselves, native understandings of their world, native explanations of their own history, native language, native cultural practices. And it's the combination of utilizing all of those three main categories to arrive at what hopefully is a much more thorough and satisfactory explanation of historical change within Native societies, even though, of course, all those areas of sources have their own weaknesses and strengths and that sort of thing, and that always has to be understood. But to me, ethnohistory is that combination of anthropology, history, Native sources all together to understand how Native history has transpired the way it has and how Native culture has changed or continued in the ways that it has.
Okay. You were talking earlier about intellectual history, and I think you gave a good example. Can you revisit just maybe with another definition of intellectual history?
Well, yeah, I mean, so there's a field of intellectual history, within both American history and other, European history and so forth that tends to focus much more on, either kind of culture leaders, intellectual leaders within a society, or the actual political leaders, or both in some cases. So intellectual history, is getting at how people conceive of their world. How do they understand their world? How do they apply kind of a method to understanding the world around them? So on one level, that's culture, but it's intellectual history when you see, because, people can think about the world around them and come up with new ideas, or they can borrow ideas, or they can reject ideas about how to make sense of the world around them. And therefore, once people, I think all of us do this in one way or another, to one level or another, we have a vision in mind, we see what's happening in the world around us, and we say, okay, well, that means X. I feel like that this means X or Y. And then you make kind of a personal intellectual decision about what action, therefore, you should take to respond to what you're seeing happen around you. Excuse me.
Okay, so that's kind of like, some of the things that you brought up talking that kind of clicked for me. And, as a GIS professional, one of the things, is always looking at, when it comes to GIS, geographic information systems and mapping and that sort of thing, one of the interesting tidbits is, that we talk about with other native GIS people is that mapping is not a new thing. We're just using new tools for, an old way of thinking. And you look at the old maps that we used to draw in the Southeast, for example, the Chickasaw deerskin map, and how it has those spheres of influence on it. Right. And that's really what it is. There's circles showing this is the influence, but this is the world that we understand. Here's a road to another world of understanding. And it shows relationships and it shows understanding, but it goes back to that, what you were talking about, that line of thinking with spirituality and information. How the chiefs had, that influence by understanding those sorts of things and being able to relay that out. And another great thing that I think you bring out in your book too is that a lot of times people talk about how they're like, oh, well, these chiefs got so much money, or they got all this stuff from this treaty. And it's like, well, yes, it went to them, but you have to understand that they were the doorway to their community. So it wasn't going directly to them. They were taking it and then giving it to their community members. So a lot of times people focus on, well, these chiefs are corrupt. They're getting all this money and all this stuff. But if you understand the culture and you understand where they're coming from, and that's where I think, that's where I think your book comes in and really helps add more foundation to that for a lot of Choctaw scholars coming in, or other scholars coming in wanting to understand that intellectual history, a lot better.
Yeah, I would add to that, one of the, and I know we're going to be talking about them soon anyway, but, French Amastaby, one of the people, one of the two leaders who I really focused on in my first book, he was accused a few times by, warriors and non-elite men of essentially doing what you suggested, or potentially being corrupt. You're getting all these gifts, but they put pressure on him, and he had really no choice but to disperse a lot of those items. But by doing so, then he built those obligations and kind of reciprocal obligations and responsibilities that kept him in position as a leader. So, but there was a lot of pressure, I think, put on chiefs over the time period that I've written about, over the second half of the 18th century and into the 19th century, by non-elite Choctaws who really tried to put a lot of pressure on people who they deemed to potentially be leaning in a direction of corruption. I think, though, by the time we get to removal, and I won't name names or anything like that, but that you get closer to some leaders maybe being more American style corrupted, right? Now, I don't know, but I think that slowly, or the possibility for that becomes more available as time goes on. Whereas initially, in the era that I really focus on, in the second half of the 18th century, it was far less likely for any individual chief or leader to be able to get away with that kind of self-serving response, because the community would not tolerate it.
Yeah, and that's what's great about the checks and balances of Choctaw society.
Right.
That it just kind of reminds me, one great type of dissertation work would be looking at the chiefs and the values that they possessed in the past, and that reciprocity, and how they were able to earn their position within the community, and compare and contrast that to our tribal leaders today. I mean, it'd be an interesting type of, what.
Right.
How does it? I don't know. It's just.
Well, of course, the Choctaw writer Leanne Howe, has explored such notions in her novels. So, so I think people have
Oh yeah.
thought about that comparison for sure. Yeah.
So the last one I have is, can you explain cultural continuity?
So this, kind of going back to what I mentioned with Jamie Carson's work, that there are, and you've kind of mentioned this as well, that there are certain kind of bedrock principles, such as reciprocity, such as, counting kinship, particularly along matrilineal lines, as well as, particular ritual practices that have been maintained over time. Language is even an element of this. There is cultural continuity that continues it, but at least in my book, what I argue is a lot of the continuity actually is maintained by non-elite Choctaws in the era, particularly by I would argue, the late 18th into the early 19th century and beyond. Whereas elites are, more utilizing all sorts of options to try to maintain their authority and have people recognize their authority. But so cultural continuity is not, there's always, I find the danger in using the word traditional, right? Because, traditional means different things to different people, right? If I said traditional, it might mean something very different to you, right? That doesn't really explain very much. But there are obviously, things like stickball, things like, green corn ceremony. There are certain kind of obvious public markers of cultural continuity, and obviously language, I would argue, is part of that as well, because language shapes perceptions, language shapes understandings, and so forth. There are aspects of culture which continue, while at the same time there's change occurring. So I don't know if that really answers your question. It's kind of, I answered it by way of giving examples as opposed to coming up with a theoretical definition. But
no, that's great. That's great. I mean, you could have also just held up your book and said, read this. So we bounced around a little bit. Before I want to continue, Megan, do you have anything that you wanted to say? Or
yeah, I was just wondering, could you give a quick overview for people who haven't read your book, because there's definitely some people in the audience who haven't had a chance yet, so if you could just do that really quick for them.
Okay. So my first book, I really follow two individuals who both lived in the Ocala or western district of the Choctaws before removal, Taboka and Franchamastabi. Both of them had other titles as well, but those were their most common names. And to kind of get at some other questions that were given to me ahead of time, why focus on them? Like I purposely did not try to write a history of all Choctaw people during this era. I focused on them because I realized once I got into the sources that those individuals, and along with many other Choctaw individuals, but they appeared in French records, in British records, in Spanish records, in American records. In other words, if you're looking at the geographical area of the traditional Choctaw homeland, the Choctaw people, of course, are the ones who are always there. And then there's these different empires coming in and interacting. But Franchamastabi and Taboka, for some similar and then some different reasons, constantly appeared in these documents, no matter which European country we're looking at. So what I realized, or what I argue I was able to do, is that I could then trace them over a pretty long period of time where they had a prominent position and see how did they exercise power, what was the source of their power, what happened to their authority over time. And the basic narrative thread is that both of them at a certain basic level utilize spiritual power to gain at least an initial higher status in Choctaw society. And at that time, in the middle of the 18th century, that meant Choctaw boys became men, when they were successful hunters, when they, particularly though, when they participated in war successfully. Either they killed an enemy or they were part of a group of people who killed an enemy, and then more accomplishments could happen. And that was, as I explained in the first book, is because war was an essentially spiritual power. Yes, there was physical prowess involved, but whether you decided to go fight against an enemy at a particular day or not, whatever the result of a battle was really understood as a spiritual power, much more so than a purely physical one. So to be successful at it, that meant you were manipulating spiritual power to a positive end, right? You were fighting against the enemies of the Choctaw people. But then Taboca, I remember being really excited when I found in Spanish documents that the Creek Indians, or particularly the Upper Creeks, referred to Taboca as Abe Coche, or Abe Cochi, which they basically, the Spanish interpreted as meaning he killed a bunch of Creeks over time. So the Creeks really respected him because he had demonstrated his power to kill them, basically. And then Taboca became really the primary kind of traditional, spiritually based diplomat for the Choctaws in the second half of the 18th century. And my argument is that his initial demonstration of mastery of spiritual power was through war, but then he turned that into becoming a diplomat, where he utilized sacred fire so that at a diplomatic meeting space they could light a sacred fire, and that anything that was discussed or talked about would have to be around that fire. And I won't go into all of these details, but there's a lot more, in the book about kind of those diplomatic techniques. And he was a specialist in diplomacy. Franchomasvi was also an accomplished warrior. We think even John Swatton thought that his name probably meant he took a Frenchman and killed him. In other words, he had been successful in war as well. But then he kind of maintained power by building relationships with various European peoples, initially, particularly the British, where, for example, during the American Revolution, when Natchez, which is a very small and ostensibly British town, although it had been French for a long time, but at the time of the American Revolution, it was British. The Americans sent a raid down the Mississippi River. The British rely on the Choctaws to respond, and Franchomasvi says, he basically leads the effort, and he's paid relatively handsomely for doing so with, guns and cloth and other material items, which he does dole out, particularly to his relatives and fellow villagers and so forth. But he works with European powers to get access to their material goods in a way that Taboca never really did. Taboca never saw such items. So Taboca, after the initial treaty between the United States and the Choctaws in 1786, it's Taboca who will lead a diplomatic mission to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to meet with the Americans, not Franchomasvi. Franchomasvi would engage in some diplomacy, but he was never a diplomatic leader, as opposed to someone who could be counted on by the British and then later other Europeans to act on their behalf if they compensated him properly. So, and which, not to say he's a sellout. I know that sounds kind of bad, but he's doing it to get these European material items funneled into his village, right? It's not just for him by himself. So to make this very too long story short, what we see is kind of two leaders who start out with an initial similar base to their initial kind of rise in some status, to then go in different directions. And so Taboca stays in a very traditional, and I would say he's the uber traditional Choctaw, right? I mean, his basis of power is absolutely purely the manipulation of spiritual power. Whereas Franchomasvi moves much into using material items to support his basis of power and authority. And so I argue that, Franchomasvi's model for power is the one that will become more prominent over time with his successors, so to speak. But what made Taboca powerful never disappears entirely. It just kind of recedes from being an element of elite power or political power, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Great. Megan, do you have anything else? Okay. So to move away a little bit, one of the things that my first time meeting you was at the NAGPRA Moundville conference that we had there in Moundville in 2010. And you stood up and you gave a talk on some of the research that you were doing at that time, talking about the Choctaw War with the Chickasaw. And then in that, the role that the Shakshihoma played in kind of settling that dispute. Could you give a little bit of background on that? And then also, what inspired you to pursue research on that topic?
Right. So, and that I did finally publish as an article or / chapter in the recently published edited collection Native South. So it's out there now, finally. So what interested me that, so, if you look at 19th or 20th century or even current kind of general understandings of the relationship between Choctaws and Chickasaws, that they're very close. Obviously, language is nearly identical. There's obviously some has been throughout history, intermarriage and so forth, and that they had really never gone to war with each other, at least not for a very long time. But we know right in the middle of the 18th century, the Choctaws and Chickasaws did fight each other frequently. And Leanne Howe also talks about this in her, at least one of her novels. So partly I wanted to figure out, okay, well then when and why did they stop fighting each other and then never fight each other again? And in works that have been published in history, the explanation was, well, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, ended in 1763. Therefore, the French left the area, the lower Mississippi River Valley, and so the Chickasaws could no longer rely on the French, so they patched things up with the Choctaws and then started interacting with the British. Now, that vastly oversimplifies the story, of course, and it makes the European powers the agents of that change. And so what I kind of intuitively, as I think ethnohistorians do, we question that explanation. And so I wanted to understand it more from a Choctaw / Chickasaw perspective. And it turns out that actually they patched things up or ended their war with very formal series of diplomatic meetings starting in 1759, so 4 years before the end of the French-Indian War. It had some basic things to do with Choctaws and Chickasaws both wanting, both arguing as early as 1757, 1758 that they realized the French were going to lose, and that they both needed, in order to maintain trade, they needed a relationship with the British. And so that's part of the background motivation, but they kept fighting. People kept dying. Small-scale attacks were just constant. And that's when, in some published British sources, it's mentioned that by a British fur trader who was in Chickasaw country, that it was Chocchumas who the Chickasaws captured a man who they thought was Choctaw, but he actually turned out to be Chocchuma. He was living among the Choctaws, but he had relatives among the Chickasaws, because the Chocchumas lived in, their descendants lived partly among the Chickasaws and partly among the Western Choctaws. And so as that's Chocchuma man, therefore, when he's brought into Chickasaw villages, he has relatives there and they vouch for him. And he tells the Chickasaws, look, the Choctaws would really like to end this conflict. And of course, the Chickasaws wanted to as well, but they had to keep responding to these killings with new attacks. So he kind of opened that door, and they sent him back to the Choctaw villages with kind of messages and various symbols that, hey, the Chickasaws would like to maybe hold a meeting. Let's talk about ending these conflicts. And that launched a series of diplomatic missions where each of the three major Choctaw divisions each sent their own delegation to the Chickasaws to formally, conduct diplomacy and engage in all sorts, various rituals and so forth, but then to formally end the war, the fighting between the Choctaws and Chickasaws. So, it shows us, of course, that Native people had their own reasons for this massive change in their history. it had a little bit to do with Europeans, but it was not being directed by Europeans. It was directed by Native people. And also it shows the role of kinship and the survival of people with a Chachuma identity who were able to use their kinship connections among both Chickasaws and Choctaws to bring the two sides together and start talking. So to me, it's a, of course, everyone would say this about their own work, and I recognize that, but to me, it's a wonderful example of how if we just read some sources that are relatively readily available, we can come up with very different explanations of some major events, because ending the Choctaw-Chickasaw War by 1759 is a major feature of both of their histories, right? Because they never will fight in any large-scale, long-term conflict against each other again after that. So,
great, awesome. And you said that was in New South?
Yeah, that new edited collection that I edited with Tim Garrison. That's actually in honor of all the contributors to that are contributed new essays. But we were all students and are students of Peter Perdue and Mike Green. So it was also in honor of Perdue and Green.
Awesome, awesome. Well, we'll try to get some of that information out too, so that some of our readers can also take a look at that.
Okay.
Cool. So, as an ethnohistorian, what do you think are the important differences between ethnohistory and history? And why is ethnohistory relevant to American history in particular? So you answered a lot of this earlier in your definition of ethnohistory, with ethnohistory being, this three-tiered, it takes in the native perspective, Western perspective, and, the archaeology and all of that. But how do you, what do you think is that big difference? Right.
So on one level, I would say that American history, particularly early American history, meaning, definitely pre-Civil War history, is becoming more like ethnohistory as time has gone on. And often and we see this in what is often referred to as social history. And that is where there's a lot more attention to utilizing sources that are not traditional historical sources. Things like, cultural expressions like music and literature and so forth, to help understand the kind of the culture of an era or a group of people at a given time. And of course, that's what ethnohistory is really trying to do, is to understand a society or a group of people from their own cultural perspective as much as can be accomplished, and then understanding how that impacts their actions, of course, and history over time. So history, in some ways, at least early American history, has become, at least the social history of early American history has become much more like ethnohistory in this attention to trying to understand the culture, depending on, of course, what group of people they're looking at, would determine the sources. I think ethnohistory, though, is still distinctive, particularly in where, as so much of early American history is now, when trying to understand why Native people acted the way they did at a given moment, that ethnohistory is still by far the best methodology to understand Native worldview and culture, in order to explain why they acted the way they did at a given moment in time. And that, therefore, there are lots of early American historians who might borrow a little bit from anthropology, certainly broaden their understanding of what is an appropriate source, but not necessarily add that third leg, and that is the kind of Native understanding or Native perspective, even when they are talking about interaction between Native peoples and European peoples sometimes. So, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, because there's plenty of really good early American history that is not just Native history, but that does a really good job with Native history. So I don't want to suggest that that's not possible, but I think ethnohistory still, because it so explicitly draws also from anthropology and also from Native understandings, is still rather unique within early American history. but early American social history has become more like ethnohistory as time has gone on.
Well, but definitely, you know, as a discipline, you know, because the way that we learn and the way that we teach is also its own culture, and it will keep evolving
Right.
too.
Absolutely.
The future of, you know, of history and ethnohistory, social history, all of that, I think is very bright, especially with a lot of the great and successful youth we have coming up today.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So, you know what? I'm going to let Megan ask this question because this is one of her questions. She was so excited about it, and I think she can give it the justice it deserves.
Okay.
Is this the language question? Or which one?
Number 7.
Number 7. All right.
It's supplemental.
Yes. So a lot of your work uses the Choctaw language, which is obviously a method of ethnohistory. And so I kind of wanted to hear a little bit about your journey in learning the language and how it shaped your interpretations of this particular kind of period. Because you're using like the Byington Dictionary, and those are created with their own kind of ideologies too, and like it kind of affects how we our own interpretations of the language, right? Because it's a missionary writing the dictionary, he interprets it through a missionary kind of lens, and so then you as a historian has to also kind of factor that, and so it's a lot of linguistic kind of work. And so I would love to hear a little bit about how you as the historian are kind of figuring all of that out with so many kinds of things to factor in.
Right. So first of all, of course, I'm not a speaker of Choctaw. I do understand some basics. It's almost, you know, when it's spoken, I can understand a fair amount of it, but I'm not a good speaker of it by any means, particularly verbs, roaming. And I'm sure you're hoping for a good methodological answer here or systematic answer. Well, first I did this and then this and then this. And unfortunately, it's not the way it worked. For me, I realized if I was going to try to explain, you know, what made someone elite in Choctaw society, but you know, how do we explain that in particularly before the 19th century, for example, that I needed to try to understand as best as I could how Choctaw people conceived of that. You know, why were some granted authority and others not? You know, what's going on? And we see little examples here and there throughout the traditional documentary sources, such as so-and-so came from an elite family, but he was relieved of his chiefly position because he refused to go to war, like he refused to fight anybody. And so that was, you know, obviously it has gender overtones as well, but you know, I argued that's because, you know, the way for a man to demonstrate spiritual power was through war, initially, at least in their lives. So I started relying on Byington a lot, and you know, you do there are in various documentary sources, there are sometimes Choctaw terms, or you know, they're phonetically spelled as best the British, Spanish person or whoever could write out what they were doing. And sometimes they offer a little hint at what's meant by a particular term. And then, of course, the titles for Choctaw men were also a window into how they determined a man, at least, was elite or not, or had high status or not. And so, you know, I started basically cross-referencing as much as I could with sources that I had that were public, you know, or had been printed largely or were available to me in the you know, late 90s, I guess, for most of this, late 90s. So I don't really have a systematic answer other than just I became extremely familiar with Byington's dictionary. And, you know, there are a lot of, I guess we call them root words in every language, but, you know, I really try to focus on root words, and I would not pretend to think that I am necessarily accurate on, or 100% accurate on my definition of certain titles and terms, but I think I got it pretty close, at least in terms of understanding something that I have not mentioned yet, and you asked me to talk about a basic part of the book, but I have not yet talked about women, but women to me were key to they were the window to understanding where power came from in Choctaw society, because women were inherently spiritually powerful, whereas men were not. Men had to earn it, but women were inherently spiritually powerful because of their ability to create life. And that was also tied to their ability to raise crops, responsible for agriculture, and so forth. This kind of cyclical renewal of life. That ability of women, was tied, very much to the power of creation. Whereas men's power is, on the surface at least, seems to be a power of destruction, right? They're killing other people, but they're killing enemies, right? They're killing people who threaten the Choctaw world. And in that sense, they're still perpetuating Choctaw life, if that makes sense. But I don't necessarily have a good or maybe satisfactory systematic answer for you about the language, other than, I did ask people on occasion, other people who knew more about the Choctaw language, about various concepts and that sort of thing. And that helped, although sometimes I disagreed with them. I think, you have to be willing, you should reach out. If I was a graduate student today, I would insist on trying to actually learn the Choctaw language more thoroughly. That was not really possible for me when I was in graduate school. I think it would be much more possible now with online sources. But that's my answer.
Yeah, well, I also just kind of really wanted people to know how much work there is behind this kind of book, and the kind of richness of Choctaw sources, and how we do have so many kind of language sources. And I just really think not enough people are doing this kind of work. And so I would encourage anyone who would be interested, there's a lot to do, and there's a lot with the language that could be kind of done if people wanted to delve into this part of the history.
Right. And I think the tricky part and this is where Byington was a little tricky, because, his dictionary, of course, has issues of its own, and I recognize that. And it's also, written really a few decades after the period I'm really trying to explain. So it has to be taken with a grain of salt. But there were little glimpses here and there in some of those missionary records, for example, where they said the Choctaws refer to, how they conceive, of the sun. And of course, the missionaries, were essentially saying it's pagan worship, right? But there was something to that. The power of the sun was related, both in terms of terminology, in terms of language, to the power of women and the power of creation, the power of life. And we also, Taboka, for example, I interpreted, is very closely related to words for when the sun is at its highest point in the sky, noon, what we sometimes conceive in our study as noon or midday. And so to me, that was not an accident, right? That there were certain things that certain root words, and there are various terms, of course, various Choctaw terms for the sun, the moon, and various things. And so they can have different meanings, but they almost always reflected this notion of creative power, spiritual power, being vital to the continuance of life and so forth. And that therefore that people who were able to enact or take actions that perpetuated life, that meant that they were able to manipulate that power, at least to some degree. So for me, it's kind of, I studied it pretty hard, but not in a very systematic way, in a way that would make linguists, I'm sure, scream with horror. But and I would try to do it more systematically if I was starting this study now.
I know you did it back in the 90s when we didn't have the same kind of level of language school. And so, right. Yeah, it's definitely way easier now to kind of learn that. I think one of the PhD students, he's in the Choctaw language class trying to learn the language, and he's an archaeologist. And so he's trying to figure it out that way. But so it is possible.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Megan. I think that's a great question, and definitely a great response. You know, it's sometimes I don't think people realize how much language plays a role in these things. You know, as Choctaws, having a descriptive language, it can help explain things that you know, we learn so much from going back and looking at language and looking at how you know, the description of these words is describing exactly what was going on in that place, or like you said, why someone was, you know, what activity they did to get their name, you know, that sort of thing. And you know, it's definitely very important. So thank you for you know, looking at language and using that. So, you know, that moves into my next question of, how do you think that your works have impacted the Choctaw community? And, you know, as an ethno-historian and, you know, I guess, you know, with your works, what was kind of your audience? Was it for Choctaw people? Was it for Indigenous people? Was it for ethno-historians or Americans? Everybody? You know, what was, you know, back then when you were first doing this stuff and, you know, putting it all together, what was your focus?
Right. I think I wrote in something to the effect in the preface of the first book, Choctaws and the Revolutionary Age, that that while I did not pretend to be Choctaw myself, that I did hope that this book reflected what I think were at least some of the Choctaw perspectives on that era of their history, newer history, to give some insight into how Choctaw people grappled with and conceived of what was happening around them, but also in their communities, and how they made decisions about how to either perpetuate their communities or perpetuate their sovereignty, or simply or to perhaps alter certain aspects of their lives, but often still with the same goal of perpetuating sovereignty and so forth. So to me, it was real important, as I already mentioned, for kind of the scholarly community to make the point, but I think also for Native people who look at published history that's been written about them, to see that, you know, it's not just, you know, and this is really describing a generation of history of Native peoples before I was in graduate school. You know, this real declension narrative that things just got bad and declined and societies fell apart. And of course, there are important elements that suggest that, right? The violence, the loss of land, or loss of control over land, you know, and disease and other things, which had absolutely undisputable negative impacts. But what does that do if that's the only story of your history and you're still alive? You know, what does that do for you, right? I mean, it does some things that needs to be known, it needs to be exposed, but we also need to know, all right, what did Native people who survived, how did they do that? What did they do? How were they able to not only survive, but recreate their societies, sometimes in a new place, particularly in the context of removal, but also, you know, how do they interact with the world they're now confronted with, right? Particularly the American world. And so, you know, and the Choctaw people, of course, were extremely innovative. You know, they really pushed American style education, which did not dismiss Choctaw education either, but they really pushed education from a very early time, as you already know, and other folks have written in much more detail about. And you know, in other words, the Native people were not just victims of history. Native people shaped history, both for their own well-being, but by doing so, they're shaping broader American history and even, you know, world history as well. Because Native people made decisions that changed the direction of everyone's history who was living at that time. So, I hope, in other words, that at least this is the, you know, in my work is far from the final answer or the final version of this, but hopefully it opened the door to, you know, focusing on histories that are of use because they not only put Choctaw history within a larger context of American history, particularly in the case of my work, the American Revolution, but also show how Choctaw people shaped those actions in where they lived, in their area, in the lower Mississippi River Valley. That the American Revolution would have been very different in that region if the Choctaw people were not there, for example. And it's true with all the other Native groups in the area as well. It's not just that they contributed to American history, they shaped American history. While at the same time, they have their own history, right? A history which makes sense from a much more of an internal perspective to Choctaw people. That's not just at the beck and call of European or American demands, but has their own demands, right? And their own internal dynamics. And that history needs to be known as well. And this is true, for all Native groups. So in that sense, I mean, every Native group is distinct and their histories are distinct. But there's also some parallels that are worth exploring or considering.
Well, I really do thank you for, all the work that you put in, because, when our office tries to answer questions for our tribal members or try to get information out there, to aid in kind of filling in those gaps that, our communities have in their history. We have to review these sources, and we take pieces, and we take pieces, and we take pieces, and we take pieces. And we understand our thought process. We understand how our people and our leaders would have thought in the past. So we have to kind of regurgitate all this stuff that's been put together. And with your work and with your focus that you have, we don't have to do that as much. It's like we can take it as is a lot of times, provide some other sources with it and say, this is how Choctaw people did things back, at this time period or this time period. This is, why we did these things. So your work has really helped our program tremendously and has really helped educate a lot of Choctaw people today. So I do thank you.
Well, I thank you. I'm deeply honored to hear that.
One question that we have, this must be Sandra. Sandra is one of our Choctaw researchers, comes from, I think it's interesting when you talk about people that are doing research, where they come from. And Sandra's line of research has come from genealogy, starting from that aspect and kind of spreading out that way. We'll talk about that more. But so Sandra's question is what are you working on now? And what are the difficulties in working with the Choctaw language in records that are hundreds of years old? So two different questions.
Right. Well, I think I'll focus on the second one first, because I also want to combine it with one of the written questions you gave me about sources. And your other question was, what are some primary sources of Choctaw history that most people would not know to look at? And I think that's important. Of course, every historian's work at least should have, full citations that you can see where they found each source and that sort of thing. But I would say for the era of history that I study in the South, that the last 3 decades or so of the 18th century don't forget the Spanish. The Spanish controlled New Orleans. They were a major presence in the lower Mississippi River Valley. They interacted with Indian people constantly, particularly both during the American Revolution, but also after the American Revolution, up through at least the 1790s. And the Spanish were, I don't know how to describe it exactly, but they were kind of the ultimate bureaucrats. They wrote everything down. And so there are sometimes multiple copies of the same document, depending on which Spanish archive, the source came from. And so Spanish records, yes, scholars have to know Spanish, although in some cases there are collections of those Spanish records which are applicable to the south in the late 18th century that have been translated and published as well in various places. But Spanish records are vital. And of course, they're vital to an earlier period of Southern history or the Gulf South. But they're vital to the late 18th century too. And they include tremendous detail. I mean, the British were also very good at record keeping, but it can be spotty at times. The French records, of course, are not at the volume of the British or Spanish records. But I always encourage people to look at the Spanish records. At the very least, if Spanish is not a language that a student or a researcher has a skill in, at least look at the ones that have been translated and published. Because there's so much information about Native peoples in the South in those Spanish records. In terms of, I also want to mention, I think part of the question you asked me was, how do you work with older sources? All sources, cannot be taken at face value. They can't be taken verbatim. You have to use them in conjunction with other sources and so forth. Ideally, we'd always love to have more than one source that confirmed a particular detail. Sometimes that's not possible, though. But you have to contextualize sources. You have to know who the author was, what was the purpose that this document was written for, therefore what bias might it have. If it's, almost all these are European generated sources if we're going back in time. Therefore, they don't understand the Native societies they're writing about very well. Although some European people do understand better than others, and they're not all the same. Some British or Spanish or French officials interacted with Native people constantly, right? Some fur traders literally married, had families with Native people, and so if their sources exist, they might provide a higher degree of insight into Native societies than somebody who never leaves London or never leaves Paris and is writing about Native people, right? Based on reports they're receiving. So, yeah, you have to critique sources. You have to know who wrote them and why. And always be willing to question them no matter what. One other thing I want to say about sources is that in Oklahoma, you all have tremendous archives across the state. Not only the University of Oklahoma, the state archives, the state historical society, but my favorite archive of all time in Oklahoma is the Gilcrease in Tulsa. And they are still kind of an unknown, partly because they don't have a very good online finding aid that describes in much detail their collections. But they have enormous collections on Southeastern Native peoples, all Southeastern Native peoples. So I'll never forget, they had an original, I assume it's a Choctaw copy of one of the treaties with Spain in the 1790s that was signed in either Natchez or what would become Vicksburg later. I forget where. But they had the original, with the wax imprint and everything and all the original signatures, and they would only let me look at it from afar appropriately, right? No touching and no pictures of that one. But in that cut, I think almost every archive in Oklahoma has a Peter Pitchling collection, right? He wrote a lot, but he also, because he corresponded with so many other Choctaw people, and because it is obvious that at various times he collected papers from relatives, and those have ended up in archives, particularly across Oklahoma. I mean, there are Pitchling papers other places too, but mainly in Oklahoma. But Gilcrease has a really nice collection of Peter Pitchling papers where there's some, I'll never forget, one source I found there was from the British fur trader Nathaniel Folsom from the mid to late 18th century, who of course went on to have, many descendants among the Choctaws, but he wrote what he was calling a history of the Choctaw people. And he seems to be only partially literate, so it's hard to read, but he had amazing insights and he answered a lot of questions that I was having that then made sense. And it's a folded up, like into a little square document in the Gilcrease. I'm pretty sure it's part of the Peter Pitchlynn collection, their Peter Pitchlynn collection. Because a lot of these families, intermarried as generations went on, and so papers ended up in different places. So Tulsa's not too far away for most folks in Oklahoma. So if you're doing research, it's absolutely worth a visit to Gilcrease, especially if you've never been there. And of course, they're world famous for their art collections and that sort of thing. So, but they have really important documentary collections that go back to well before removal.
Actually, the next trip to Shirley is actually with our research group, and we did a trip to the Gilcrease to go through the Peter Pitchlynn papers.
Awesome.
And so I'm sure they'll talk a little bit about that when we have them in 2 weeks. So just throw that plug in there too.
Well, that's I'm glad to hear that. So Ryan, what was the first part of the 2-part question you just gave me?
Yeah. So did you have any difficulties working on older Choctaw language and records? So, that's one of the things that a lot of our speakers, look at today is we try to even go back to late 1800s records, and the Choctaw language there that was, in government stuff and then, in written stuff is very different than what people are speaking today. So even within 100 years, 100 plus years,
sure,
the Choctaw is hard to translate sometimes because the way of thinking has changed.
Right.
Did you encounter any of that when you were looking at language?
A little bit, although, unlike the exact title is escaping me, the recently published, Choctaw Council proceedings that were originally written only in Choctaw from the pre-removal era that were recently published. That's a fantastic source that I did not utilize in my book. And so a lot of what I was dealing with were not entire documents written in the Choctaw language. It was often European sources or American sources, kind of mentioning certain phrases and that sort of thing. Like, the Choctaw people refer to this with this term, and they would try to spell it phonetically, right? And so it can be tricky to figure out what they meant, or did they you never know, did they understand it correctly, and so forth. Where I worked with that, probably in the most significant way, was that first treaty between the Choctaws and the United States at Hopewell. And there's 2 versions of the proceedings of the treaty. And they were, until I published the pre-removal book, essay collection, they were only in archival form. But there would be little phrases in there that the American transcriber was trying to say, he's trying to describe, he didn't use these words, but you can imagine him, he's essentially saying, I don't know why the Choctaws are doing this, but here's what they're doing. And, he would use a term, and he said that they keep saying this, this term he would try to say. And so that's the kind of glimpses of language that I was getting, as opposed to entire documents or letters written in the Choctaw language. Those kind of sources seem to be derived much more from the early 19th century and after.
Was the book you were talking about A Gathering of Statesmen?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and that's by Pitchlynn, Hag, Willis, and Kidwell.
Right. Yeah, that's a great. I love the way they did that, because they have the English translation, but also the original Choctaw side by side, and it's a real. I think that's a really kind of an underappreciated book, but it's a really important book, and it exposes some. It's just like work that's being done on the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper from the pre-removal era these days is showing, where also it was bilingual, that the Cherokee portion does not mirror the English portion does not mirror the Cherokee portion, right? The Cherokee portion is saying something different often. And so I think that's what you get in that book as well, is that, how Choctaw people conceived of their new constitutional government in the late 1820s, kind of runs against the grain of what scholars have written about that era of Choctaw history.
So we have another question. Ian chimed in, and he asked, what became of the Chocchoma or Shakshihoma?
I'm sorry, did you already ask the question?
Sorry. Yeah, Ian asked what became of the Choctioma or the Choctioma.
Right. So that's a good question, and I think deserves more research. A lot of the published research before I looked into that diplomatic negotiations between the Chickasaws and Choctaws in the 1750s to end their war. A lot of the scholarship that existed said that Choctumas were already kind of disappeared. They'd already been dispersed among, some said primarily the Chickasaws, others said primarily the Choctaws. So it seems, and we do know that kind of famously, Robert Cole, in fighting for compensation from the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, talks about his mother as a Choctuma woman among the Choctaws and so forth. And sometimes I've seen her therefore described as the last Choctuma woman, but I doubt very seriously that's the case. I think the identity that some Choctaw and Chickasaw people still knew they had Choctuma ancestry, I would imagine, well into the 19th century, if not even potentially beyond. But so my answer to that is that they intermarried with and melded with the Western Division Choctaws and then the Chickasaws as well.
Yeah, you dropped off. We're still good though. Sorry, Megan was coming and checking in. So.
Technology failures.
Yep. So cool. Let's see. We have another question from Angela Walton Raji. Were most of the Pitchland papers focusing on communities in and near Eagletown? So that may be a great question for our next Choctaw Show later.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that one.
Yeah, I think we can definitely bring that up with our research group this next time.
Okay.
So I guess the last question I have for you at the moment is, something that something that we know is that you encourage your students to work with tribal communities, and that's something that's great. We're currently working, with one of your students. So why is it important for scholars to consult with tribal communities and Indigenous communities?
Yeah, well, these days there's no excuse not to, would be, first of all, my first admonition. But there's a couple of significant reasons. One, from a purely scholarly perspective, if you want to help ensure that the information you have or your understanding of a particular aspect of culture or your understanding of a particular event within a Native group's history, that you need to know, well, how do they understand that event or that aspect of their culture? And of course, keep in mind, like all societies, one Choctaw person might have one perspective and another Choctaw person might have a different perspective or a slightly different perspective. And that's important, but it's, but so in terms of just accuracy, kind of factual accuracy, Native peoples study their own history, right? Obviously, they have historic preservation offices. They do this for a living, so to speak. So they have a vested interest in vital interest in trying to make sure that history is accurate. The other part is that this is Native history belongs to living peoples, right? Living Native descendants, living Native communities and nations, and they should be consulted. I think because of that, because of their sovereignty, because of their survival and so forth, they deserve to be consulted. Not necessarily to have to give final or approval of a particular interpretation per se, because many scholars might balk at that sort of thing, but it's just a matter of respect, right? A matter of recognizing that these are Native nations and Native peoples that still exist and still are trying to answer many of these same questions that a historian or an anthropologist from the outside might also be trying to answer. And therefore, hopefully, the model would be, as it has been with you all, which has been really great and so positive, and I'm so appreciative of, it should be a collaborative model, ideally. But at the same time, if Native groups decide, you know, we don't want to work with non-Native people, that's their right to say that.
So, if you were given the chance, you know, let's say that you're in graduate school right now again, what do you think you would have done differently?
Well, probably there's a lot of the things we're just talking about. Actually, reach out to Native communities in a more direct way, and I think particularly in my case, I mean, I felt relatively comfortable with my sources, but you know, it's about the interpretation, right? To, you know, am I way out of bounds here, or and even if this doesn't make sense in today's context, does this make sense in a previous or a historical context, you know, to Native people? So that's something I would have done differently, as well as something we already mentioned, and that is more specifically, you know, sought out expertise in the language. No, but I think collaboration is vital, and you know, going forward within the scholarly community, it's really no longer acceptable not to collaborate with Native groups, or at least make the sincere attempt to do so.
And that's why we need more Native scholars of our own, because if, you know, if more and more groups do start, you know, contacting, wanting to work with Native communities, we're going to need more people from our own community to be able to do work like that, just like Megan has.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any questions for us? Do you have anything that?
No, other. You know, I obviously I've been. It's really, I just have a lot of appreciation to express. You know, I've gotten to know Ian some over the years at various events and through correspondence, and you know, your Historic Preservation Office is doing great stuff, and this video conferencing, which then exists, I assume, forever in video form on the website, I think is a tremendous resource. And I know you all had already been doing you know, kind of more internal and elder focused, you know, events like this for a longer period of time, but I think bringing in some of these outside folks just to get different perspectives and an expanded audience for the work that you all are doing is a fantastic step, and I'm glad you all done it. And you know, it's one thing I think we're noticing with a lot of like the American Society for Ethnohistory, my primary home academic organization. You know, like all the others right now, are doing virtual presentations and virtual conferences and that sort of thing. And I hope that never goes away, even if we do somehow control COVID-19, which I have my own doubts about. But I hope this aspect never goes away, at least not entirely, because it's been so useful, and it's gotten people together in a format and in a way where they would have never really interacted much in a purely physical manner before. So so I applaud you all for that, and don't really have any questions other than to kind of ask what's next. What kind of things you're all going to be doing next in terms of kind of initiatives for the Historic Preservation Office?
That is a great question, and you know, that it almost feels like it changes from, you know, day to day, but you know, we just want to, you know, for our office, it's continuing to serve our people, continuing to serve the needs of our people. So as long as, you know, our tribal members and our communities keep reaching out to us and letting them know this is what we need, this is what we want, then we will continue to follow, you know, that way. And you know, it's just a lot of it is just getting the expertise in our office. You know, over the last 10 years of being here, it's been amazing to see such great Choctaw academics, you know, in the community, you know, and just, you know, coming through our office and working, and it's just, the future is very bright for Choctaw people, and I'm very, very excited about the next generation that's up and coming, and, you know, to be able to play a role to help support them is just amazing.
Right. Well, that's exciting to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Megan, did you?
oh yeah, since I just popped into Ryan's office, we are in the cultural center, and like we really hope that it can be a hub for people to kind of come to us once it's safe, of course, and to be able to engage people in that way and have a lot more kind of face to face. And we're really looking forward to that kind of future that we know is coming.
Right. Yeah, this is a great format, but there's still something to be said for face-to-face interaction as well. So I think the ideal in the future would be to have both kind of equally, or have events that are purely virtual, but then have a follow-up event that's face-to-face, or vice versa, or something like that.
Well, maybe in the future we'll be able to meet with you at the height of full sun.
Yeah, sounds great.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And maybe this will open doors for opportunities between everyone. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have some folks who are in need of a graduate degree in history, either I might be able to help, or I know there are lots of other scholars out there who are doing similar types of history.
Great. Yeah, that would be awesome. Well, I thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for everything that you do and everything that you will continue to do.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. We'll go ahead and let go from here. Feel free, if you all have any other questions, feel free to contact Megan or I, and then we'll try to get as many answers as we can. Megan, would you like to tell everyone when the next Choctaw Tosholi is?
Yes, so our next Choctaw Tosholi will be with our Historic Preservation Research Group, which is obviously our independent researchers that works with us. And so that will be Thursday, October 22nd at 1 p.m. So join us then, and peace a lot to everyone.